Introduction. Knitting is a comforting pastime that produces concrete results. Make a scarf, a blanket, mittens, or other wearable fashions using yarn and 2 or more knitting needles. Knitting is a hobby that is portable. Take it on a trip. Take it to work, do it at lunch, or relax on the front porch or in front of the TV and knit. Anyone can learn how to knit, and the action will bring calmness to the mind and body. In order to knit, learn only 2 major types of stitches. Once those 2 stitches are learned, the knitter can create just about anything. Those 2 stitches are the knit stitch and the purl stitch. Different combinations, adding or decreasing stitches, and altering the stitch slightly makes it possible to create sweaters, gloves, socks, and other things in all different patterns, shapes, and colors. History. Records as far back as AD 200 report that weaving wool using 2 or more needles made cloth used for clothing, blankets, and other objects within the community. Knitted cloth, instead of weaving thread on a loom, makes the fabric stretch better and it snaps back into shape more quickly. The ancients used the knitting technique to make clothing that needed to stretch but stayed close to the body without sagging. Included were stockings, leggings, gloves, and other garments. The oldest known knitted artifact is, in fact, a sock. Middle Eastern and Egyptian tombs showed evidence of knitted items from ancient days. The Spanish employed Muslim knitters to make gloves, covers for cushions, and wearable garments from yarn. In Scotland, during the 17th century and continuing into the 18th, being a knitter was an actual occupation. Heavy knitted sweaters protected Scottish fishermen during the winter, as the wool had a waterproof effect. The Scots created some of the most intricate knitted patterns, like the cable stitch and Aran stitch. During the Industrial Revolution, spinning wool and knitting procedures mechanized and became less expensive. Soon people depended more on mass-produced knitwear than taking up needles and knitting themselves. A resurgence of the craft took place in the early 21st century with the development of interesting yarns using llama hair, cotton, silk, and bamboo. Today, there are thousands of knit patterns available to the public for baby clothes, gloves, hats, sweaters, afghans, toys, and just about anything else. This ebook will focus on the different stitches, patterns, and how to make a sampler and a few other projects. Chapter 1. Needles. Knitting needles come in a variety of sizes and lengths. Metal needles are the best for a beginner, but needles come in wood and plastic too. The most important feature of the needle is to be as smooth as possible so the yarn easily slips on and off. Types. Straight needles are the classic type of knitting needle and have a straight shaft with a pointy end and a disc or ball at the other end to keep the stitches on the needle. Metal and plastic needles have a disc or cork end with the needle size imprinted at the top. Bamboo needles often have a ball at the top with the size burned into the needle itself near the top. Double-pointed needles have points at both ends and usually combine in 3s or 4s to make socks, gloves, hats, or anything that knits around in a circle. They have points at both ends so that the stitches can slip on and off both ends. Circular needles are 2 needles joined together by a thin, flexible cable on which the stitches fit. Circular needles are good to use when you make a piece with just one seam knitted in the round, or a piece that has too many stitches to fit on standard straight needles. It is best for beginners to start out using the straight needles as they are much easier to work with. Size. The diameter of the needle indicates its size. U.S. sizes run from 0 to 50, with size 6 to 10 being the most popular sizes. European and Canadian needles use metric numbers to label them. Both types come in a variety of lengths. The pattern used dictates the size and sometimes the length of the needles used. The European equivalent to a U.S. size 7 needle is 4.5 millimeters, and the equivalent to a U.S. size 10 needle is 6 millimeters. Chapter 2. Yarn. The multitude of yarn available is astounding. Yarn comes in all textures, colors, and thicknesses. Choose the proper yarn for the project at hand. Patterns will specify the correct type of yarn to use. Sheep wool, silk, cotton, linen, animal hair, acrylic fibers, nylon, rayon, and other substances are all used to make yarn. When just learning how to knit, use acrylic yarn as it is easier to handle and less expensive than other types. All yarn has a ply. This is the amount of strands twisted together to make one strand of yarn. Yarn that is 4-ply has 4 strands and is the easiest to use for the beginning knitter. Yarn comes in skeins, balls, and hanks. A skein is one portion of yarn wound into an oblong shape and held together with a paper label around the middle. Some handmade yarns do not have the label, but should have some indication of what the yarn is made from, how to care from it, and how many plies were used to make the yarn. If the yarn does not come with this information, it is best to steer clear of it. Handmade yarn is usually twisted and formed into a circle. The yarn from the hank is best wound into a ball first in order to keep it from tangling. Some yarns come in balls where the yarn comes off the outside, or it is wound so that it is pulled from the inside of the ball. Anyone can wind a skein or hank of yarn into a ball simply by tearing off a little rectangle of paper and folding it in half. Place the end of the yarn so it is sticking out of one end just a few inches. Most likely, the yarn will come in a skein. Start winding the yarn around the paper. Once an oval is made, wind sideways and long ways around the paper, making sure the end still sticks out. When you are finished winding all the yarn, pull the paper out, leaving the end sticking out. Use this end to start the project. The label on the yarn imparts the ply, type of yarn, and other information needed, like care of garment. The ply indicator will look like a skein of yarn inside a little white square. On the label of the yarn will be a number. Common yarn weights vary from 0 to 6, with 0 being very thin, used for lace work, and 6 being heavy for super bulky projects. Medium size, also called size 4, is best for beginning projects, while yarns marked with 2 make good socks because it is thin enough to be comfortable within a shoe. Yarn marked 5 works well for winter blankets or mittens because it is very dense. Always knit thin yarn with thin needles and bulky yarn with large needles. Chapter 3. Gauge. Gauge is very important in knitting. If the gauge is not right, the project tends to be too big or too small. Gauge is the number of stitches needed to knit 1 inch in length and the number of rows needed to make 1 inch. Some knitters work their stitches loosely, while others pull it tight, making the gauge slightly bigger or smaller than it should be. Using a thicker or thinner yarn than what is called for in the pattern can affect gauge. To check the gauge, make a small square with 20 stitches. Knit until the square measures 3 inches. Place the finished square on a table and flatten it out. See how many stitches made 1 inch and how many rows made 1 inch. It should match the gauge specified in the pattern. The gauge for the above square is 5 stitches equals 1 inch. The gauge for the square below measures 8 rows equals 1 inch. Chapter 4. Necessary tools. Knitting requires some other equipment besides yarn and needles. The equipment includes 1. A ruler or measuring tape measures gauge and length of the project. Many patterns require measurements to know how long or how wide to make a piece of the garment. 2. Scissors cut the yarn when changing color or finishing the piece. Always use scissors instead of tearing the yarn apart. Tearing can cause the yarn to separate, and one ply might be pulled harder than the other 3, causing a pucker. 3. Blunt yarn needles come in plastic or metal and have very large eyes that allow the yarn to fit through. Yarn needles are not sharp because it is easy to work them through knitted yarn without having a sharp point. Knitted cloth has lots of little holes where the needle can easily penetrate. Yarn needles stitch components of a pattern together. An example would be stitching a sleeve to the body of a sweater. 4. Stitch markers are plastic rings that come in a variety of sizes and colors. They curl around and are sometimes open so that they are easily slipped over a stitch or over the needle to mark certain points of the pattern. 5. Stitch holders look like big safety pins. They hold stitches temporarily in order to get them out of the way of other stitches that receive more rows. An example of this would include making a mitten. The finger part of the mitten is put on a stitch holder while the thumb is worked. Once the thumb is done, the finger part of the mitten is put back on the needles and knitting can continue. 6. Stitch counters sometimes slip over to the stopper end of one knitting needle. They have little wheels with numbers on them that indicate the number of rows. After each row is stitched, the knitter changes the number 1 up. The numbers usually go from 0 to 99. A beginning knitter does not need all these tools at first. They need the yarn, needles, a measuring tool, and scissors. The other tools can wait until the knitter decides that they wish to do more knitting and go on to more complicated patterns. Chapter 5, Patterns and Abbreviations. Always choose patterns that include the following: materials needed, including type of yarn and needle size, gauge for stitches per length and per row, has easy-to-read directions, has a photo of the finished project to compare. Most patterns come in one size, but they give alternates for other sizes. These show up in parentheses within the pattern. Here is an example: knit 4, in parentheses 5, 6, 6. The number 4 is for small, 5 is for medium, the first 6 is for large, and the last 6 is for extra large. Reading a pattern is like reading a map or a different language. Abbreviations are used, and each abbreviation means the same thing in all patterns. The abbreviations are generally universal, but most patterns print the abbreviation key at the end of the pattern. If it is not there, find most standard abbreviations online or in other books about knitting. Many times, a special combination of stitches is used over and over again to make a specific pattern within the pattern. These stitches may be given special names that are unique to each pattern, and they are presented at the beginning of the pattern. The following are a few of the most common knitting abbreviations and their meaning. Approx means approximately. Beg means beginning. Bet means between. BO means bind off. CC means contrasting color. CM means centimeters. CO means cast on. DEC, deck, means decrease. DPN means double pointed needles. GST means garter stitch. INN means inches. INC, ink, means increase. K means knit. K2, tog, knit 2 together. KF and B means knit in front and back of stitch in order to increase stitches. KYs means knitwise. Sometimes a pattern will want you to slip a stitch off the carrier needle to the receiving needle without doing any more to it. The point of the needle is inserted as if to knit as opposed to purl and slid off onto the receiving needle. LH means left hand. LT means left twist. MC means main color. MEAS means measures. MM means millimeters. NDL means needle. OZ means ounce. P means purl. P2 tog means purl 2 together. PM means place marker. Pass slip stitch over knit or purl stitch. P-wise, purl-wise, see knitwise. REM means remaining. Rep means repeats. RH means right hand. RND means round. RT means right twist. SK means skip. SKP means slip, knit, pass stitch over, a method of decreasing. SL means slip. SLST means slip stitch. SLLK means slip 1 knitwise. SLLP means slip 1 purlwise. STST means stockinette stitch. ST means stitches. TBL means through back loop. TOG or TOG means together.